This video was made possible by my lovely patrons such as Cassie Fox, Henry Michelle, Paul Comagliano, Randon Pearson, Shopping Cart, Jamie Harris, and Selena J. Fleming, along with my $15 patron, Lucifer King. If you would like to join them, you can at patreon.com/salamander18. Hi, my name is Sally, and I'm kind of a 40k fan. If you couldn't tell by the fact that I named myself after a chapter of Space Marines and... Wait, haven't we done this already? Fuck, hold on, let's start over. Hi, my name is Satyr Mixable, and I was once a fan of 40k. Now, that's a bit hyperbolic. I still really love 40k. It's still one of my favorite sci-fi universes of all time. But I'm frankly kind of burnt out on keeping up with the universe on a regular basis the way that I have been since I was 15 years old. I don't want to contribute to the dumb, constant negativity toward 40k and GWUC from 40k's own community on YouTube, especially given the typical ideological predilections of the kinds of people who make monetized tantrums over plastic army men a lucrative career. With that being said, however, I would still feel remiss not to point out where I think my growing cynicism towards 40k comes from. And I can pin it on a series of 3 continual creative decisions on the part of Games Workshop that I feel points towards a sickness in the way that the company handles the franchise that dooms the universe to a fate of mediocrity. So, rewind back to the 2010s. Warhammer Fantasy is in a bubble. Armies aren't really receiving that many updates anymore, usually only getting a new big centerpiece model occasionally, which nobody actually buys. Everybody still playing Fantasy pretty much already has all the models they'd ever need or want, and not that much new blood is entering the scene. So, in an attempt to get people to buy more Warhammer Fantasy models, GW opted to lower the points cost instead of introducing new models, which meant that armies with the same point costs as before raised in real money costs, which theoretically would force players who already have full armies to buy more models in order to fill out the remaining points. So now, even less people are buying Warhammer Fantasy models, because less people are playing the game because of the exorbitant price of buying a full list. Repeat this cycle for a decade and you have a bubble that is about to pop, and Games Workshop is about to engage in a last-ditch effort to save Warhammer Fantasy, the End Times. End Times, stated briefly, was a series of novels and campaign battles which depicted the forces of chaos, led by Archaon the Everchosen, launching a crusade which would culminate in the final destruction of the world. This is kind of an ultimatum on the part of Games Workshop. They decided to do a big, scary crisis event to garner attention for the setting. Attention which would, in theory, result in more eyes being on the setting. More eyes meant more wallets, which would mean more model sales, with the obvious unspoken insurance of this whole thing being that if this plan were to fail, it wouldn't matter, because they could just say, oh, Chaos won, the universe has been destroyed, time for a reboot, let's try this again. It's not like they'd lose anything. They had been losing money on Fantasy for a long time now. However, there was backlash to the End Times. Not a bit of a backlash, but a lot of backlash. And yeah, despite it giving some attention to factions that desperately needed it, like Bretonia, it had the opposite effect GW wanted. It didn't put eyes on Warhammer Fantasy and make people want to buy the models, it put eyes on Warhammer Fantasy who were only there to mock this shark-jumping moment, this very clear moment of desperation from Games Workshop to have an ailing series regain some level of cultural relevance. So, they pulled the trigger, and Warhammer Fantasy was officially taken out back and shot, which gave us Age of Sigmar. However, the failure of Warhammer Fantasy had a ripple effect across the entirety of Warhammer, because across the aisle, 40k was going through something of its own End Times crisis event with the Gathering Storm campaign. Gathering Storm was a campaign book for 40k 7th edition which featured a number of narrative missions that would advance the plot of 40k into the status quo it would have going into 8th edition. However, the thing I specifically want to focus on is the introduction of the newest Eldar faction into the galaxy, the Ynnari. The Ynnari were a cult to the Eldar god of death, Ynnead, who was killed in the birth of the Dark Prince, She Who Thirsts. However, this cult's prophet and leader Yvraine had a plan to stop Slaanesh, and maybe all of Chaos. In Eldar legend, there are these 5 swords, called the Crone Swords, fashioned from the finger bones of the god Morai Heg. It is said that should all 5 of these swords be gathered together, it would give the wielders untold power over life and death. The plan being to gather the Crone Swords together, resurrect Ynnead, and have him finally, once and for all, defeat the forces of Chaos. And when the Ynnari were introduced, their characters had 4 of the 5 Crone Swords already. Now, there are some huge implications that would come with actually destroying Chaos, all of which would basically make the success of the Ynnari bring about something of an end times for 40k. Perhaps not ending in the literal destruction of the entire setting, but at the very least changing it up into a wholly new state. The Ynnari were poised to change the status quo of 40k irrevocably. The Ynnari were going to do all that. However, after 2 books, the Rise of the Ynnari book series was cancelled due to poor sales. Poor sales, which were a result not of actual disinterest in the faction, but because they decided to release it exclusively as a paperback book before releasing it as an ebook. It was then revealed that the 5th Crone Sword was inside the Palace of Slaanesh, and that because of this it was, quote, unreachable. This essentially took the Ynnari, which were introduced as this powerful new force who were poised to change the universe of 40k as we knew it, and turn them into another largely irrelevant army, which will probably stop getting new codexes in a few editions. So, what exactly is responsible for this massive directional shift from Games Workshop? Well, a lot of things, but I see 2 primary reasons. The negative reception of the fantasy end times, and the backlash toward the Gathering Storm event, in particular, as it was actually happening. Games Workshop has this tendency to get cold feet about big committal changes when there's a chance for fan backlash, and so the negative reception of the end times probably sent a bit of a message to Games Workshop. The people don't like big reboots. They don't like massively changing up the setting. That ship already sailed for fantasy, but we need to avoid doing that for 40k. On top of that, there was also some level of significant backlash against the release of 8th edition and the Gathering Storm event, with a certain subset of the 40k fandom putting their foot down and stating proudly, "No! Everything's changing! Everything's changing too fast! No! Stop!" Which, despite the flippant and dismissive way I just explained, on some level made sense. If you are a 40k fan from the years 1998 to 2016, the 40k you fell in love with would consistently remain the 40k you returned to. That couldn't necessarily be said for 2017 onward. Sure, the changes weren't exactly drastic, but pushing the timeline of the setting forward into the next millennium, destroying Cadia and Bieltan, introducing the Ynnari, bringing forth the 13th Black Crusade, was several magnitudes more development and change than the series had ever really seen in such a short period of time since maybe the release of 3rd edition. 40k was changing, and for many people it was changing too quickly. Sadly, for many others, changing too quickly still just means changing at all, and GW was willing to capitulate to that backlash. This is obviously speculation, but it seems like pretty well substantiated speculation via lots of circumstantial evidence. 40k is suddenly going through the biggest paradigm shift of its entire history. Primaris Marines are introduced and lauded as the last hope for the Imperium. The Ynnari are on the hunt for the final Crone Sword in order to reawaken Ynnead. The Harlequins are mobilizing to fight the forces of Slaanesh in the name of Kegarach, and Robude Guilliman's been reawaken to lead the Imperium into this turbulent, uncertain future. And then all of it just sort of stops, incredibly unceremoniously. We find out that the 5th Crone Sword is in the Palace of Slaanesh. The 13th Black Crusade is just squashed by the Ultramarines. Everybody who is threatening to basically do a civil war against Rowboat Gilman are either killed or shut up without a word. Kegorach just keeps laughing it up in the Black Library. Nothing that was threatening to be important actually ends up doing anything of value or significance. And we're all allowed to just return to a pre-Gathering Storm status quo, just with the Imperium now having a bunch of new toys. And that includes the Ynnari, one of the most interesting things to come out of 40k in decades, just to be sidelined, like every other Xenos. 'Cause, yeah, this isn't exclusive to just the Ynnari. Oh man, now I get to talk about this. As a 40k fan, the most interesting part of the setting for me has always been 40k's colorful cast of fantasy-inspired alien races, which when seen within stories that focus around them are generally allowed to have much more dynamic character motivations beyond what is allowed for Imperium characters. The Eldar just kinda want to be left alone, and while they often look down on humans as primitive and naive, they've been shown on several occasions to work with humans, and it's been established that in the Dark Age of technology, human colonies often had trade relationships with the Eldar, which points to them being more indifferent to alien life rather than actively malicious. And seeing Commander Farsight struggle with the idea that maybe the masters he once trusted to have the sum total of all knowledge in the universe may not know as much as they let on, or potentially actively lied to him as he becomes torn between his duty to the ethereal caste and the undeniable evidence that he's seen with his own eyes, until he eventually becomes so disillusioned he simply up and leaves regular Tau society, forming the block of heavily fortified colony worlds which came to be known as the Farsight Enclaves, is in and of itself far more captivating and interesting to me than any number of war speeches about how heretics and aliens are bad or something. However, it's clear to see that GW itself doesn't really have the same sort of fascination with the Xenos as I do. Taking a quick gander at the store, it's clear to see that Xenos model lines are far and away the most outdated on average, with most Craftworld Eldar models coming from the late 90s. Yes, Imperium also has a few older models still kicking around, with the Rune Priest and Terminator armor, according to Wib anyway, being the oldest model still in active use in the entire game. With that being said though, they are nowhere near equivalent. Space Marines in particular get a shitload of model line updates, having gotten several new models per year since 9th edition came out. When the last time the Tyranids got a new model in the last decade was when a Tyranid head was used as a base decoration for a limited edition Catachan model. That's it. That's all you get. If you're a Xenos player, you get to be the head the victorious space fascist stands on. You see, this neglect doesn't just stop at their model line. It's in everything. GW often works on a Monster of the Week format, where they cycle out which factions represent the greatest threat to the Imperium at that point in time. Usually it's whatever non-Imperium faction is getting a model line update at the time. It was Chaos at the start of 8th, it was Necrons at the start of 9th, and now that the Tau are getting model line updates, they're a bigger focus now. So it's this trend where one other non-Imperium faction at any given time is getting even a minuscule amount of attention, though even then it's often comically low in relation to the Space Marines. Every other faction at any given time? Well, maybe you'll get a piece of artwork where you're being butchered by Space Marines, and if you're lucky, it may be Sisters of Battle instead of Space Marines. Sometimes. This is one of those things that's inherently cyclical. Games Workshop just wants to make more models for the armies that sell the best. They see that Space Marines and generally just Imperium factions sell the most, so keep updating those model lines, only to then never update the Eldar or Tyranids. Nobody wants to buy shitty looking old models that came out when I was still in diapers, so they buy the new and flashy Space Marine models. So GW looks at that and concludes, oh, people must want more Space Marines, and we start back at square one. Historically, there have been many factions that have simply been ignored and neglected by Games Workshop for similar cyclical reasoning. Bretonnia hadn't gotten a model line update in like 20 years. Well, that was because nobody was buying them. But nobody's buying them because they hadn't gotten a model line update in like 20 years. And so the cycle repeats and repeats and repeats until Bretonnia is literally removed from the setting entirely in Age of Sigmar, because Games Workshop just assumes that nobody likes them, when that's not the case. They're my favorite fantasy army. And I miss my Grail Knight boys. Please bring them back. This is a cycle rooted in Games Workshop just trying to give the fans more of what they already want, without actually knowing what it is that the fans want in the first place. I doubt there's many people who think it's fair or good that the Xenos get neglected as much as they do, even as others somehow unironically believe that the Tau get preferential treatment from Games Workshop. And why? Because they want a battle or two in the lore? Actually, nah. We're gonna talk about this now. I guess it's no wonder that I'm bitter, right? For those unaware, my favorite faction in 40k is easily the Tau. Specifically Farsight Enclaves, but just generally speaking, the Tau are my favorite faction in 40k, right in front of Eldar and Slaanesh. With that in mind, it shouldn't take a genius to find out why I've become slowly burnt out with 40k over the years. I hate that my favorite factions get constantly, at best, sidelined and ignored like the Ynnari, and at worst, turned into the perpetual punching bag of every faction in the universe like the Tau. I'm truly mystified at how some Imperium players can, with a straight face, genuinely say and believe that the Tau get preferential treatment or have comparatively high amounts of plot armor to the Imperium. To the mind of the average Imperium fanboy, the Space Marines or the Imperial Guard losing even once is enough to signal that a faction has immense amounts of plot armor, because they believe their own faction deserves to be so singularly dominant and centralizing within the setting that even a Pyrrhic victory against them should be considered a fantastic day and a historic victory for the enemies of mankind. This is the fate of all Xenos within 40k, to one degree or another, but I think the Tau actually represent a very special case with this. The Tau are one of the newest factions in modern 40k, and still they're old enough to go to the local convenience store and get a fucking White Claw. They represented something that 40k fans across the board tend to despise: variety. When the Tau entered the 40k landscape, the setting as a whole was basically about as morally complex as one of those incredibly edgy, all-evil D&D campaigns everybody always does once and then swears, never again. The Tau in this landscape were different. They had an actual end goal that was informed by a coherent ideology beyond, we just kill the things. And even though they were kind of pitched as a good guy faction, this was more of an inference made by the player base than an intentional writing choice by Games Workshop. They were the good guy faction wholly because they had an ideology that expanded beyond the realm of just wanting to do a genocide against all the people who weren't like you. There were hints from the beginning that the Tau were something of an authoritarian regime that seeks to dominate the galaxy, only opting instead to dominate through subversion and ideology rather than through violence and bloodshed. Which made sense, given that the Tau were the youngest spacefaring race in 40k up to that point, still are, and lack the industrial capability to wage the sort of full-scale wars that the Imperium does. This made them unique, interesting, and cool, and everybody hated it. So, something I've especially learned through having to deal with the comment sections of my own videos for the last year and some change is that a lot of people engage with 40k rather uncritically. They basically view it as a free-for-all deathmatch, the equivalent of a 24/7 two-fort server that's been playing the same stalemated game for the last 3 decades. And despite my demeanor, I do mean this entirely descriptively rather than prescriptively. If this is how you want to engage with the universe, lore, and tabletop, then go right ahead. I do not care. I do care if you decide that you doing that shoulders you with the duty to barge into my comment sections demanding I do the same. With that being said, I can't help but feel as though the early backlash to the Tau was derived from this mindset of 40k as a Gmod dark RP server with poor moderation. The Tau sort of threw a wrench in that whole gig because they actively did not want to participate in that affair. They would rather have a planet willingly join their side than simply bathe in the blood of its inhabitants. Either because they physically lack the numbers to do so, or because they made the very basic logistical analysis that said that that's a terrible idea no matter how many disposable bodies you have. This, naturally, ended up ticking a lot of people off, and GW was quick to make massive overhauls to their lore, all of which was directed at making the Tau more grimdark. Logic be damned. However, the damage had already been done, and the entire 40k community had developed something of a hate fascination with them. Specifically, the 40k community, more specifically, Imperium players by and large, are weirdly obsessed with putting the Tau through as much suffering as possible. Reveling, to a frankly creepy degree, in the destruction and mutilation that they face. In particular, I think it's telling that they have a specific fascination with the time the Tau tried to ally up with the Dark Eldar, which ended exactly how you thought it would. The Dark Eldar requested the Tau send over a group of Tau as political ambassadors, immediately captured them, enslaved them, turned them into horrible monstrosities, and then sicked them on their own people. And if they were lucky, it would happen in that order. I feel as though this exact moment is so particularly a focus among the people who hate the Tau because it shows them essentially being punished for their hubris. They dared to disrupt the perfect, harmonious, unchanging, and unmoving raw setting of it all in order to try and inject some jolly cooperation. And now we get to partake in a great deal of schadenfreude at examining the consequences of trying to disturb the holistically brutal status quo of the 40k universe. There's an incredibly potent, grim fascination with Tau suffering that GW itself also partakes in, and on some level, I feel at least, it reeks of self-flagellation. It's akin to presenting an idea in an essay, having your professor rip it apart in class, and then make a new essay where you exaggeratingly criticize and lambast that original idea in an attempt to win back favor with the professor, by essentially trying to overly cater the views and stances to fit with what the professor already believes, instead of trying to challenge the expectations of them. And I think this points to the real issue here. Warhammer doesn't have a Xenos problem. It has a Games Workshop problem.
Your craft world burns, alien. Your warriors bleed. Your people die this day.
How proud you must be of your ability to inflict atrocity.
All good art has to be willing to challenge audience expectations. Note how I very specifically said willing to challenge audience expectations. There is plenty of art out there that is quite good using a fairly paint-by-numbers formula, which makes sense. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. At the same time, there's a lot of art that centralizes its entire identity around challenging audience expectations, and it decides that should the audience expect us to fix what is broken, we'll subvert their expectations by breaking it further. With that being said, though, sticking with convention, just as much as changing up the formula, is a tool in the writer's tool belt. Any tool that's used dogmatically to solve every situation is eventually going to break from misuse, and in that regard, every good piece of art that wishes to be good sustainably, in my view, needs to be willing to change up the formula and defy audience expectations. If you just give people exactly what they want for 3 decades, sure, they'll like it. And the people who really like it will probably stick around and be content with just getting the same thing over and over again. But people like me, who want to see growth and evolution and, God forbid, fucking change, well, we're kind of left in the dust. Games Workshop is, as I believe I've demonstrated in this video, ultimately motivated more so by a fear of pissing off their fans than anything else. They cancelled plans for a potential Ronadondra end times after the negative reception of the fantasy end times and shoved the Ynnari to one side, ridding them of any sort of lore relevance. They think that Xenos are unpopular among 40k's fanbase, when in reality it's a self-fulfilling repeating cycle that GW refuses to break. Games Workshop thinks that their fans just want more Space Marines, so they keep releasing new Space Marine models, don't give any other faction any amount of support, leading to less people buying them, leading to GW thinking that their fans just want more Space Marines, in a self-fulfilling cycle of neglect. And in the specific instance of the Tau, once fan backlash against them reached a certain point, GW opted to simply join in. All in all, Games Workshop lacks chutzpah. They lack any sort of courage or bravery in their creative decisions. Everything they do to appease fans, not to challenge them. And perhaps some people don't like to be challenged by their art, and that's fine. But variety is the spice of life. And in this regard, Games Workshop, with their over-reliance on fan service and repetition, doom their settings to ultimately become stale. And that, my friends, is Warhammer's Xenos problem.
Hey! Like an unbladed swallow starts a fist fight. Your right to property is antithetical to Christ. Hey! The time is right, so if you got something to prove, so a fucking yellow and black triangle flag on your verse. I'd like to make a little